school psychologist.
Good evening and welcome to Providence Road. Thank you for joining us for our last conversation around mental health, or at least our last conversation in our Wednesday night series on mental health. We are so glad that you've joined us tonight, and if you're online or in person, welcome, and we are so happy that you're here. Each week, it's been a blessing to be with our panelists, and this week we've got a great panel to be able to talk about the topic of shame. So I'm going to begin with Morgan, and Morgan, tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll work all the way around to Susan.
Hey, I'm Morgan Lavender. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I have been in the counseling field for a little over 10 years in North Carolina, ranging from community mental health to care management, and working with a wide range of ages and diagnoses and issues.
I'm Jim Katsoudas, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor as well. And I've been working in the field as also about 10 years. And mainly I work with men, and many of the issues that they bring in could be anything from anger issues to trauma. And I work with Sure Hope Counseling, and that's me.
And I'm Susan Steyer, and I work with Jim as well at Sure Hope. I work with primarily women, partners of sex addicts, working through the healing process and betrayal, infidelity with individuals and couples, as well as just basic marital counseling issues.
Well, Susan, Jim, and Morgan, thank you for being with us tonight. We are honored to have you, and we'll just jump in. So, Morgan, you have been our most frequent panelist, and one of the things that we've tried to do each week is begin with definitions, because we've learned that definitions are really important when we talk about mental health issues. So, what is shame?
I have notes here tonight because there's so many nuances and words, and so I'm going to refer to them as I talk through. So I'm going to start with that. Shame is something that every single person feels at some point in their life. One definition that is out there on shame is that shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. So when you kind of unpack that sentence a little bit, shame is often confused or used synonymously with guilt, but they are two very distinct things. So one of the clearest ways to distinguish guilt and shame is guilt is a feeling of doing something wrong, whereas shame is feeling that you as your being is wrong. So practical example, guilt is I should not have done that, but shame is I am a horrible person. So guilt is really about an action, where shame becomes an internalized feeling that is something that's about your identity to the core of who you are. And it is a core that it is a flaw within you as a person. And so that would be kind of my initial conversation about shame.
Jim, Susan, anything else that you'd like to add?
I was thinking exactly what you said.
Jim, could you hold your mic up?
Oh, I'm sorry. Exactly what Morgan said is when a person feels shame, they often don't want to talk about it. They often try to hide it because it's something that's very painful for them. And so sometimes when clients come in, they don't always bring up the issue of shame. They talk about maybe feeling some anxiety or some depression. But then once we start going further in it, they start to bring up the shame once they feel safe with a therapist. Because the one thing is, I think a lot of people who feel shame are fearful of being shamed over again and over again. So they want to make sure that people around them are going to be safe people to talk to.
One thing I'd add to that, when I was reading some articles on shame, it kind of stood out to me, is that the guilt feelings, you tend to focus on, oh, I did something, and, how did that action affect another person? Whereas shame is more of a focus on self. And so you're not really looking at how what you did affects people besides just you, and just really self-focused.
Morgan, when we began having discussions about this series several months ago now, and we began to line out the different topics that we wanted to talk about, you made a recommendation to us that shame should be our last topic. Tell me a little bit about why you made that recommendation.
So as we went through most of the weeks and we talked through depression and anxiety and we talked through anger, almost every single week that we talked through how there's other emotions that often come about or hide as a part of these mental health issues. Shame is one of those. So there's kind of two sides to shame, in that shame is both created out of mental health and can be a cause for mental health. So if you think of it, if someone has depression and they are feeling worthless, they then can start to, focus solely on those feelings, and that becomes a part of shame. The topic of suicide, families who have experienced a suicide in the family, those individuals feel such shame, and part of that goes back to what we originally talked about in this series too, about the stigma that comes along with it. And so shame is present in a lot of mental health conditions. There's some research out there that shows that shame is actually the dominant emotion or feeling that is expressed in almost every mental health disorder, even higher than emotions like anger. Shame is present. And then, what Jim said is when there's shamed upon shame, you also have shame that increases mental health issues as well. And so since shame is weaved so tightly in with mental health issues, but just everyday human life, that's why I suggested to kind of wrap up the series, because it's present in every mental health area, but is also just present out there. And again, one of the things I think about is you have an example. We've talked several times about things to say and things not to say, and why throughout this series. So you have an example if you have someone who may be experiencing depression or anxiety. And if they're already experiencing these things and they're feeling like, hey, I can't control this. I'm not a good enough spouse. I'm not a good enough husband. I'm not a good enough mom. I'm not a good enough wife because I can't control this. I can't control this anxiety, or I can't control this depression. It's not stopping. They start to feel shame that they can't stop it. They may not be good enough. They don't meet the expectations of people around them. But then at the same time, if they get brave enough to tell someone and that person responds with something, and well-intended or not, and it's a comment that ends up promoting more shame. So, a comment, for instance, like, you should just pray more. It would stop if you prayed more, as an example. Then the person feels, well, now I'm not a good enough Christian either. And so shame can compile on top of it by other comments. And so, part of the reason of bringing it at the end of this series is shame is something that every single person has felt at some point in their life. But it's so just innately engraved into both the lives that we lead and in the way that we communicate and respond with each other. Shame is caused out of relationships and expectations in relationships with each other, but shame is also healed through relationships and vulnerabilities with each other. So that was some of kind of why I suggested it at the end of the series, because it both impacts it, but it also can heal and allow that vulnerability in relationships to rebuild, which is what we've talked a lot about in this series as well.
I think a lot of what shame does too. Sometimes when you're looking at shame, it looks like trauma, but it's not really trauma. It seems to hide like it acts like a trauma, because with people sometimes, especially with men, when I'm working with men, many of them will, when they start to bring up the shame that they felt, they usually go into either a flight, fight, or freeze stage. And that is what happens with people with trauma.
So Jim, where does shame come from?
Where does shame come from? I think it comes from the very beginning as we grow and learn about life with our parents, our family, or the family of origin. We begin to realize, through the interactions of our parents, we realize we're doing good, we're doing okay, we're not doing too good, we're doing bad, we've been bad, those kind of things. You know, it's just part of the development. And it's so, shame often is mixed up with guilt. And I think one thing that Morgan was talking about, we have to be very careful to help a person realize that they're really dealing with shame or they're dealing with guilt. Because guilt is easier to help the person understand that they can do something about it. You know, they usually want to do something about it. With shame, it's harder. They don't always bring up the shame to talk about it.
So are there questions that you will often ask people to be able to differentiate between shame and guilt?
Sometimes I ask them because they'll bring up things and they feel guilty about something. But as I begin to work with them, really what they're feeling is shame. And so the guilt is part of the shame because they feel like they've done something bad, or it's really their own perception they have that they've done something bad because they've been told by somebody that they're bad or they're flawed. So.
One question that I ask is, if they're talking about a situation, I'm just going to say, because it's one of the things I deal with, infidelity, is I might ask the question, okay, because of what happened or because of what you did, what message or what messages do you hear about yourself? And even have them list them or write them down, and then have them write in, like, say, the column next to it, though, but what does God say about who you are? You know, and sometimes that is helpful to identify, you know, is this shame or is this guilt?
I think what you just said about the message that they're telling themselves, that often comes out. So when someone actually is in a safe environment and actually starts diving into this, because this stuff is hard. Shame and vulnerability are some of the hardest things to actually talk about and work through. People are uncomfortable with it. People don't want to talk about it because you're talking about the very core inside of how you feel about yourself, and it hurts and it sticks with you. And even people who are trying to be helpers and listen, it's sometimes hard to listen, right? If you have a friend telling you about it, it's sometimes hard to hear that level of vulnerability, and people don't always know how to respond to it. So when people are those comments about, well, I should be this, I have to be this, and when you start digging into those shoulds and have to be's is usually when you start finding out what their perceived message is about themselves. Well, who told you you have to be that way? Who told you you should be that way? Why do you think you have to be that way? Because at the core of it, it's how they define how they believe they should be based on kind of other expectations. And that's where a lot of shame comes from, is expectations and people's perceptions. There's some stuff out there and a lot of research out there that for women, shame comes a lot from unattainable expectations of what a wife should be, a mom should be, a woman should be out in society and in relationships. And for men, a lot of it in research has come down to they can't be perceived as weak. So while women, it's more expectations, men, it's they can't be perceived as weak. And so a lot of shame comes from, for men, if something is perceived as weak, and for women, if I can't meet the expectation of what a fill-in-the-blank XYZ person should be. And that is a lot of what causes that shame of those should messages and those how they perceive themselves.
And Morgan, I love what you just said, the question about, who told you? Because that's really what is mirrored with Adam and Eve in the garden. God comes in the garden and he asks, where are you? And then his next question is, who told you this? And so I really appreciate that. So Morgan, when we hear the phrase shame-based culture, I know sometimes we'll hear that on TV, we'll read it in news stories. What is shame-based culture? What is that?
So You can look at it a couple of different ways. So there are cultures and countries in this world that still exist as a shame and honor country, right? They are very focused on you bring honor to your family or you bring shame to your family, and that is just embedded into the core. And then you have countries that are more focused on kind of guilt rather than shame. But there's also another way to look at a shame culture too, in which society embraces shaming and judging and blaming other people because it's easier. And so there are cultures where the easiest thing to do is, if you start to feel uncomfortable or shame, that you immediately go to blaming or judging because it makes you feel better and it deflects the shame off of you. But at the same time, those same cultures have this immense value that you should be acceptance and belong. And so you end up in a shame culture where it's super important to be accepted and to belong, and yet it's super important to make sure that you don't feel uncomfortable, and therefore you end up shaming and judging other people. So the culture is to fit in, and yet fitting in has almost never been harder than it is today. So there's quite a few different things about shame cultures, where you have society expectations that you should shame, or you have entire cultures where through religion and through history, that is the way that the culture is set up and derived.
I think one of the things that's very confusing to think about a shame-based culture, and here in our country, I think a lot of it comes from how we we want people to tolerate everything, but we really don't want them to tolerate. We really want them to come to our way of thinking. And if you don't think their way or my way, then I'm going to shame you for it. Yeah.
So, Susan, what are some of the causes of shame? That when we think about shame and things that cause shame, what are some of those?
Well, the first thing I'm thinking of is family of origin. Like we talked about earlier, what messages do you hear and then where do they come from? And so I know I spend a lot of time asking people about their family of origin. Tell me about mom and dad. Tell me about grandparents, and even going back to great-grandparents, because, even in Exodus, it talks about generational sin and how impactful it is. And so I think it's really important to spend time looking at that. And I often find that with the client, they'll have an aha moment of, I never thought about it, but my great-grandmother, da-da-da-da-da-da, and then my mom, and maybe that's why I think this way, I guess I didn't realize where that came from. So I would say definitely family of origin. And then also, too, I think to add to that, anytime you experience a trauma or witness one, and, sometimes it might be, a domestic violence situation, but sometimes it might just be something innocent where you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I've heard it said, I don't know if any of y'all could speak to this, but if your child, if you're in an accident, even a car accident, or you're in, an area and there's one that happens right in front of you, the trauma of that, just praying over traumas and just for God to help heal because of what trauma can do to the brain as well.
I want to add on one thing to the family of origin. Oftentimes the conversations aren't what was said, but what is not said. So a big thing in therapy that is talked about is family secrets, right? Every family has them. What you don't want other people to know, what you're not going to tell someone. XYZ aunt has this diagnosis or this addiction, and all of the things that you keep protected within your family because nobody else could know. That right there is one of the things that causes shame across generations, because people learn not to talk about certain things, right? Oh, we just talk about that inside, but when people start realizing, hey, we never talked about this, we never addressed this, we never let it known that was an issue, it's because there is a fear and a shame, right, of what will people think if they knew. What will people think if they knew that this was in our family? But to break that myth, every single family has secrets. Everyone out there. But those family secrets and the ways that families deal with those is how it ends up going down through generations, and it can be stopped, and people can work through it, and people can start talking about it. But I would say those family secrets are one that you will see if people aren't intentional about it, will go from generation to generation without people realizing that they are doing the exact same thing and holding similar family secrets.
I agree with that completely because sometimes when you're working with people, they'll hint around things. They'll hint around things, and they'll not come out and say it. But what they're really trying to talk about are the family rules, the family secrets and stuff that they're hanging on to. But even though they start to see those secrets as being detrimental to their own health and everything.
So Jim, how does shame manifest itself in behaviors?
With men, I think shame is at the core of their identity because it's always about being weak or strong. You know, how they begin to see themselves. Sadly, a lot of men believe in male stereotypes, and if they don't measure up to that male stereotype, they start to feel like they're not a man, that they cannot do certain things, you know. And so the shame will attack a man in his core of his identity as being a man, being a husband, being a father, being a worker, whatever. And so because everything goes back to am I good enough? Am I strong enough to do the jobs to do the jobs I have to do? Yeah. And when men are dealing with shame, often sometimes the symptoms of shame looks like they're dealing with depression. It's the same. They get they get involved doing risky behaviors. A lot of men will begin to act out sexually in bad ways, you know, looking at porn in different ways like that, because the porn makes a man feel powerful again. So.
Any other ways that men may exhibit those behaviors?
Really, mostly it's through one thing is the difference between a man and a woman. The woman internalizes the shame, which they internalize the depression as well. For men, it's more of an outward. Something's making me feel ashamed. It's not internal. It's something on the external.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So.
Would you say anger would be one of the ways? Because
anger's a big one.
in the sermon that you on Sunday, I really liked. What was it? Shame that is not transformed is transmitted.
Yeah.
And so that projecting that anger.
Right. Yeah.
Do you see
that? Men get very angry with their shame,
mm-hmm.
and often they end up taking the anger out on themselves as well.
Hmm. So, Susan, I know you work with a lot of women and those who have walked through the trauma of betrayal. So, how does that shame sometimes manifest itself in behaviors for women?
The first question, the biggest thing I see is, what's wrong with me that I had no idea this was going on? Or how did I not see this? You know, that's, I would say, one of the initial questions is kind of that shame of, you know, I must be stupid, or I just must, you know, be clueless that this has been going on for all this time and I had no idea. And then sometimes it looks more like, what's wrong with me that I didn't pay more attention? Like something told me that, you know, I saw this text here, or I maybe saw this history here, but, I asked and it was explained away. And so I just, went about, on my way in good faith. So then there's the shame of, why do I not feel like I should stick up for myself? And just tying into the differences between men and women, I'm thinking of Stacey Eldridge wrote a book called Captivating, and one of the biggest questions that she said that a woman asks herself from the time she's a little girl is, am I lovely? Do you delight in me? And how a little girl will put on a dress and she'll twirl around and ask her dad, am I pretty? Do you like my dress? And, the expectation of, am I pretty enough for, whoever, or for dad, and then for my husband. So then when they come to find out that their husband is looking at other women, the biggest feeling of shame is, I'm not good enough. And so, part of that is educating them on, helping them understand that from the men's perspective, it really has nothing to do with, they could be a supermodel, and oftentimes that is the case. It has everything to do with the man's shame and how they're medicating themselves in that. So,
I think I would add to that for women also with other forms of shame. It can often manifest in increased anxiety and increased depression. So feeling, am I not good enough? That same context, but for a lot of other scenarios as well, am I not good enough? And that goes into, well, what do I need to do? How do I control this? And it can kind of become a cycle for a lot of women that way. But anger also, right? So snapping, there is a book that talks through kind of some of that lethality when shame is in a relationship between a man and a woman. And a woman can start kind of making the conversations of, why aren't you ever doing this to the man? And starts continuing making those comments because they feel shame. And then the man feels shame by feeling criticized and therefore starts lashing out and so it becomes a cycle of shame too. And so that irritability can play both with the men and the women. The comments may come out differently, but that irritability just provokes people because the reference to the trauma is right. And I think Rachel and Matt talked about this too, but shame it is a physical response as well. You feel physically affected when you feel shame. People feel hot, they feel flushed, temperature, right, get sweaty hands, they feel physically affected, and it kicks off that fight, flight, or freeze. And right, we've talked in several of the other weeks, that fight response often gets perceived with anger and lashing out verbally in certain ways, because it's the easiest and quickest thing to do to make you feel less shame, is to try and deflect.
I agree with that completely. And with men, often the anger just rises up, and then they feel shame for being angry. So it's like a cycle that keeps it's almost like they're in this. It's like a mouse in a wheel. They keep going around and around in it and stuff, because they keep thinking, okay, I'm bad now because I feel this way, and they're getting closer to actually being able to talk about their shame, but yet as they get closer to talking about it, they start to withdraw again, because again, talking about the shame brings up what they're feeling is what they're feeling at the core of themselves. Bad. I'm flawed. Something's wrong with me.
So Morgan, because of your training, this question is probably best directed to you, but how do children process shame? Because we can talk about men and women and the differences in that, but when you're a child, what does that look like?
You see a lot of the processing of shame as the same way. When a child is shamed, they will have the same physical reactions, the same emotional reaction. But a child usually does one of two things. They inwardly kind of look down and try and hide from it, or they're going to start outwardly expressing and anger, things like that, to push it away so that they don't feel it. Because shame is one of the hardest emotions for kids to understand and be able to process. one of the things with kids and shame, right? We talked about family origin is one of the biggest areas of shame, is that a lot of kids do learn shame from within their own homes, unintentionally or not, right? I think every single parent out there has said something or done something that caused shame to the child. I'll be the first to admit I have. And then something has come out of my mouth and I've been like, I know, whoops, shouldn't have done that, right? And so I think one of the things that parents also need to remember is, right, we make mistakes, and one of the best things kids can see in parents is when we acknowledge and we, right, repair the relationship from that. We acknowledge, hey, I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have done that, or hey, next time we're gonna do this differently. Because it's really easy, it's very easy to slip into using shame as a parenting tool because we think that it will make a child respond quicker, and there are a lot of studies out there that show it does not. Guilt is actually more effective, but you don't want to, right, extremes, don't go there, right? And so for parenting and kids, shame is one of those things that when a child feels shame, when they are very young and they are shamed, and I would say consistently, right? If they consistently receive shame, to the core of them, if you think about that painful feeling, they feel that they are bad and alone, and they feel that they will never be good enough. Well, when you have a child who grows up consistently hearing that message, it doesn't disappear when they become an adult. It stays, and every single time a bump in the road comes, that child's confidence, or that now teenager's confidence, is not quite there at the same level. And so again, I would say the consistency is the key, because it happens. Kids throwing a utter tantrum, right? I think every parent may have had this. Kid is throwing a horrific tantrum in the middle of a store. And as a parent, what do you feel? Oh my gosh, everyone's watching me. No one else's kid is throwing this tantrum. I am alone. Why is this happening to me? Well, you're feeling shame. And so what's the easiest thing to do? Snap at the kid, because then you're deflecting the shame and you don't feel quite as bad. But then we've just transferred shame to the kid. It happens, but again, it's that consistent, right? If a child feels shame consistently over time, their confidence as they grow up is undermined by the fact that they feel that they are not good enough. So there's lots of ways to balance it and have those conversations. I would say one of the best things that can be said, instead of going into an immediate shame response to someone, is, hey, tell me what happened, and letting the child, kid, teen actually express what happened back first in their own words, and then kind of making plans. But, the stronger relationship that you're building with your child, to have an open relationship and to have open, honest conversations, allows for that room for, one, when mistakes are made, but for two, for that vulnerability to be there. And we'll continue to talk, but, right, talking about things reduces shame. If you talk about it, the shame disappears. If you talk about it, the shame lessens. And so for parents and kids, having that relationship to be able to have tough conversations, to be able to have open conversations, is probably one of the most fundamental things that parents can give kids as they grow up, because then they learn how to talk about things and how to have hard conversations, because adults have to have hard conversations too, but kids do. And so when you teach them how to have hard, tough, challenging conversations in healthy ways, it just, immeasurably more helps them as they grow.
So as a parent, what are some keys, or maybe some questions or some pointers that you would give to them, Morgan, about how to begin those conversations? How do you start? Where do you start?
I'm again going to caveat this with, I am only 6 years into the actual parent thing, so other people have a lot. But it's developing the relationship where it's okay to talk to them. If every time a child comes to you and talks to you about something and you shut it down because you're busy, you don't want to talk about it, it's uncomfortable for you, then those are signs that the child is not going to come with harder conversations. So it's starting to talk about the easier things, and then it builds, right? If you have an environment where, hey, you know that you can come talk to me no matter what's happened, and I may be upset, but we are going to talk through it and work through it, that alone sets a foundation. where they know, right? If the reaction is always, why'd you do that? You knew better. That was wrong. If that's always the reaction, your child is not going to come and have those tough conversations and challenging conversations. But if the reaction is, okay, let's talk about this. What happened? Those are the conversations in which, the little bits, they say, right, you have the whole concept of kind of trust is earned for a lot of people. Well, it's the same in those conversations, and it's the same in vulnerability, right? If I come to you and you don't react the way I think you're going to react with a small thing, I'm more willing to come to you with a medium thing. But if you immediately shut me down at a small thing, I'm not coming to you with a medium thing. And so allowing those conversations, no matter how small, no matter how young, hey, I might be mad, but let's talk about this. And allowing that conversation to work through, and that's kind of one of the biggest steps is, and it takes a while to do that. It takes a while, no matter what age you're at, to be able to have that trust. But again, it's saying, I am here, and no matter what happens, no matter what you do, I love you, I am here, we will work through this. It doesn't take away the emotions as a parent you might feel. It doesn't take away the right or wrong of a situation, but it allows that honest communication to happen and for you and the child to actually develop a plan of, okay, next time, what are our plans? And reaffirming positive decisions that the child can plan for the future. The more you can focus on some of those positive affirmations of future plans and things like that, the more it negates some of the negative reactions that they may take away from a situation.
Jim, Susan, what would you add? Susan, we'll start with you. Anything that you would add to that?
I'm smiling because my oldest is sitting out here. She's 18, and my husband and I have 5 children. So I'm thinking, she could come up and say a lot. But anyway, the simple saying, I can hear my mom saying it to me, is shame on you. Why did you do that? What's wrong with you? I mean, it reinforces that message of, yeah, there is something wrong with you because you did that, and I mean, I don't think we're trying to convey the message to them, shame. I mean, we're not perfect. We're fallen too. But just to reiterate what you said, Morgan, one thing that we've tried to do, and obviously have not done perfectly, but is, when we say things or react in anger to our kids, and my husband and I hold each other accountable to do this, is to go back and apologize and talk about it. Because it's not like we want to say to them, oh, you're never going to mess up. As followers of Christ, it's when you mess up, what are you going to do about it? We're going to own it, and that's part of becoming an adult. And even we have 2 boys, and my husband will always, we have this little saying where we say, a man takes ownership, but a boy blames. So we need to own it. We need to own what we did, and then furthermore, we need to make it right. So those are just some things that we try to do with our kids. So
Thank you. Jim, anything you would add?
I think with one thing I'll say about parenting is that if parents will remember, if they're punishing their child and they go too far, they say things that to the child that could be making the child feel ashamed or anything. One of the powerful things that I hear, even from clients today who still remember their parents coming back to the child and apologizing. When a parent is willing to be vulnerable to their child and say, I made a mistake, would you forgive me for it? That goes a long way in helping the child not to carry the shame.
So Jim, when we talk about the effects of shame on us emotionally, spiritually, physically,
Yeah.
What are some of the effects of carrying shame, long-term shame?
Would you repeat that?
Sure. When we think about the effects of shame on ourselves spiritually, emotionally, and physically. What are some of those effects
Okay.
of long-term shame that we carry?
Well, one thing you see physically, they do, a person who is feeling ashamed, the way they carry themselves often. They keep their head down. Their face is usually constricted a lot, And also when you if you get them to talk about it and open up, they get this kind of sick feeling over their stomach, where they feel like they're going to be sick, Spiritually, I think it really, a lot of it goes to how is God, how I'm so flawed, how can God love me? How can God forgive me because I'm such a mess, So emotionally, they just carry it. They carry it deep inside, and it takes a while to get a person to open up and share, just to talk about the shame, because what I see with a lot of men, just talking about it makes them vulnerable. Being vulnerable, they internalize it as being weak, so they don't want to talk about it a lot. They just, but once they start talking about it, you can almost see the healing happening within their bodies and stuff. Yeah.
Susan, what would you add to that? Anything?
Can you repeat that again? I wanna make
Sure.
I
What are the effects of shame that when we think about long-term shame and the effects on us spiritually, emotionally, physically, what are some of those effects?
Definitely, I would say depression, anxiety. I think sometimes I wonder about insomnia, people who struggle with sleeping, or people who want to sleep all the time. As far as physical symptoms, I think spiritually, I wonder, you hear people say, oh, God can't do anything with me, I've messed up too much, or I don't know why God would love me, or, he wouldn't accept me. My sins are too much, so.
Morgan, anything?
We kind of talked about this at the beginning of why the series, but shame, long-term shame also has been shown to, right? We've talked about depression, anxiety, but substance abuse, eating disorders, suicide, all forms of violence, domestic violence especially. There is a lot of shame tied into domestic violence. If you think about domestic violence, we talked about it briefly, but that is tied into a lot of power and control. And right, shame for men is feeling weak, ties in a lot with domestic violence. But any sort of an addiction, not just substances, but all forms of addiction, because what people are trying to do, I think Jim alluded to this, there's people trying to escape. And so you're trying to go to things that would make you feel better, and they're not necessarily the healthiest choices. But I would say there's just a lot of long-term mental health issues that have arisen out of very deep shame.
So before we take some questions from our audience, and by the way, if you are watching and you have a question for our panel, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes or so taking those questions. You can text those to the number on the screen. But before we begin taking questions from our audience, Morgan, how do people recover from shame? This will be the last question. I'll ask each of you to weigh in. How do people recover from shame?
There's a lot of stuff out there and research that's been done on shame resilience, and it basically comes down to kind of three main areas that I've seen. And one is sharing about shame. Again, I've made this caveat before, but making sure you're sharing with safe people, right? But having that person to share. So the biggest thing about shame, there's a quote I wanted to read, but it says, this is from Brene Brown, which if you want to read about shame, she has a lot of resources out there available. But it says, shame hates it when we reach out and tell our story. It hates having words wrapped around it, and it can't survive being shared. Shame loves secrecy. When we bury our story, the shame metastasizes. So one of the biggest ways is to actually be able to talk about it, because it makes it not so, right? We've talked also about things being unmanageable, and when we mention it, it's more manageable, and it ties right in with shame. Being with others, a connection. Shame often makes us feel like we are not connected and that we don't belong. So finding connection and finding people, and empathy. So both developing empathy for yourself, but also developing empathy with other people. Again, that ties you into the connection. It ties you into a belonging with others, an ability to understand and feel where those individuals are coming from and sit with them in moments. And so those are kind of the three main areas that are out there, and a lot of shame resilience. But it is tough work. It is possible. It never goes away entirely. I think every human will experience shame in various forms. And it's something that you have to be very mindful of, because it's very easy to get caught back into. There's a lot of stuff out there that Brene talks a lot about stuff with shame triggers, but there's a lot of things that'll instantly pop in your head that you have to be very mindful that you're going down that path again. But those are kind of the three areas that I would say.
Jim?
I think a lot of people, what I try to do with clients is get them to have self-compassion, is showing themselves, being kind to themselves, being able to say, you know, I'm okay, I'm just okay. Once we get there, they can start showing themselves some self-love in a healthy way, you know.
I was going to mention self-compassion, but on the addiction aspect of, you know, like we talked about how shame, you know, makes us feel bad, and so we want to escape, or I would use the word medicate, because we feel bad. So then we maybe develop an addiction, whether it's an eating disorder or alcohol, you know, fill in the blank. So when we think about things like AA or SA or Weight Watchers, the whole idea is community and support and connection. So encouraging people, you know, to, oh, you're struggling with this, you know, or groups like Celebrate Recovery, because like you said, as soon as we bring it out in the open, it doesn't have as much power. So that's what I would say.
So we'll begin with some audience questions, and thank you all for the questions you've submitted. And I will start with you, Susan, then we'll give everybody an opportunity to weigh in on this first question. Susan, how has social media impacted the prevalence of shame in our culture? How has social media impacted the prevalence of shame in our culture?
Well, that is a fabulous question. I think maybe I was listening to your sermon when did you talk about that in your sermon? I listened to so many things, but I remember somebody was saying, you know, you did something bad, you know, when we were growing up, and there was nobody who could video it. And nowadays, nothing, you know, everything is out there. So as far as social media, I mean, you can just hop on Facebook at night and see who's on a vacation or who created this great new quilt or cake or whatever, and you can automatically hear a message, well, look at what they did, and you can't do that. So the self-talk, I think, is significant there, to be able to celebrate for that person. Wow, that's really cool. She can do that. That's awesome. You know, we're all given gifts and talents, and I believe they come from the Lord, as the scriptures say. And so there's nothing wrong with celebrating what someone else has. It doesn't mean it has to take something away from us. So I think we have to be really important with social media to watch our own self-talk.
I agree with that. Sometimes that's where I'll see a lot of people will shame each other on social media. And it just brings me back to how angry people can get when they feel like their voice is not being heard or something. But it's just really sad to watch how social media has become more of a tool for people to use to bash somebody else. You know.
I would also just give the reminder that social media is one picture and not the whole picture. It's very easy to go into social media and to see someone else's life who looks like they have it together, and you think that that is the whole picture, and it's not. It is one picture, and it's one form, and it's one piece, and it's one portion. And so for people who are dealing with shames that feel like they're not good enough or they don't measure up, it can be a dangerous area when all you see is a perfectly selected view of somebody's life, or a perfectly selected view of this new thing that they created, did, made, any of those things. And so it can easily be forgotten that it's just one view and not an entire picture.
So, Jim, next question from our audience is, what are some tangible things that churches can do to create a culture that combats shame? What are some tangible, intentional things churches can do to create a culture that combats shame?
I think one of the things that's very helpful for, I know with men who are dealing with shame, is to have a safe place, like a group that they can go to open up and talk about whatever they're going through, because that's one of the hardest things for men to do, because they don't want to be vulnerable. They fight the thought of having to share because there's this lie that men believe in often, is that if I share my feelings, I'm being weak, But once they get into a group, and the group is a common theme of everybody being safe there, you can bring up and talk about these things that are bothering you. For example, a group for men who are dealing with porn, for example, is a powerful way to help them overcome the porn, but also to overcome the shame that is associated by looking at the porn, because they start to realize, I'm not alone, other people are like this, we're going through the same thing. And so that's why group work often is very helpful for people. And so I think if churches can put groups in place for a people, to talk and open up and share.
Morgan?
I would say conversations like these, the sermon series where we talked about things being just, right? We talked about some very bold topics, and we talked about some things and made it more normal. I think a lot of churches have a history, right, that hard conversations we don't talk about, and it's not the place to talk about them. And there is a lot of shame within many churches and religions. And I think having these open conversations, normalizing things that people deal with and struggle with, bringing words to them, bringing definitions, bringing language that people aren't alone, I think is probably one of the most important, because when people feel like they're not alone and that they're hearing that message in community with other people, they're more likely to feel like if they were to talk to someone that they would be understood or heard, because they're not alone and everyone just talked about it. So whether people think certain topics are normal or not is a everyone has a perception of normal, and just vocalizing that these things are happening. It's not happening outside of the church, it's happening within the church too. And having those conversations, I think, just normalizes it, because it makes people feel not as alone, and that allows people to be a little more willing to be vulnerable, which vulnerability will reduce shame.
Susan, anything you would add?
Can you repeat the question? I was just listening
Sure.
to everything she said, and I realized I forgot.
What are some tangible ways and things that churches can do to create a culture that combats shame?
Well, one thing I would say is maybe constant examination of any prevalence of legalism, because I think legalism promotes shame for sure. I don't know if you want me to expound on that, but you just think about traditional church. I was sitting here thinking when you first had that question, even so much as dress code. How if somebody comes in for the first time and how they're dressed and how everyone else is dressed, and then, well, how do we treat that person? Or maybe if they have a tattoo or body piercings or. So, yeah, I think legalism sometimes can definitely promote shame, for sure.
Morgan, while trying to avoid shaming yourself or others, are you at risk of minimizing the guilt too much?
That's a tricky question because you use both guilt and shame in the question, and they are two very different things. So, if someone does something wrong and makes a bad decision, there are ways that you can frame that conversation with the person that is not shaming. Because remember, shaming is to the core that they're a bad person. And so if you're telling someone, well, you messed up, you're bad, that's obviously the shame side. But you can have conversations with people about like, hey, do you know that this is wrong? You can have conversations about, do you see how this hurts someone? Those are healthy conversations to have that are not necessarily shame. Shame is when it takes it to the next extreme, that they're never going to get it right. You always mess up. Why did you do this? You always do this. Those are the things that take it more to shame when you're making it about the person and not about the action. But when you're focusing on an action that someone has done, whether they feel guilt or not, or if you're trying to make them realize, when you're focusing on the action, you're staying in the conversation around guilt. But when you're making it about the person and the person's, you're making generalizations to a person, that's when it kind of takes it into shame. So I think conversations about guilt are, in certain contexts are the right conversations to have, and you should have to acknowledge actions and to acknowledge things that can be done. I think shame is when you're taking it one more step and you're making it about that is because of the person and not because of an action. So keeping it focused on the action is a little healthier in terms of conversations for people.
I would agree with that completely, and I think in churches we can help people disarm themselves with the shame by helping them understand, how much God loves them despite their flaws that they may have. And once one of the most powerful things I think anybody that's helping a person overcome shame is when they start to realize that how much God does love them just the way they are. That it's the very core. They're broken, they're bruised, they're messed up. It's okay. God still loves them. And then that's where the journey begins to heal them.
Well, I don't know of a better way to end our series than on that note. And Jim, thank you. And Susan, thank you. And Morgan, thank you for being with us. It has been a blessing over the last several weeks to have this time with you on Wednesday nights. And I hope that if you have found something valuable and wonderful, which I have in the series tonight, or in the discussion tonight, I hope that you'll consider sharing it on your Facebook page or to social media so that others can have the blessing of being able to listen to this as well and hopefully be helped by it. Also, we want to remind you to please visit our website for resources and also this series and the sermons that you've heard referenced on Sunday morning, and also the different conversations that we've had on Wednesday nights will be in our library. So please be sure to visit those in the future, or to point someone to them in the future, because we hope that they'll be there for a long time. But thank you again for joining us, and thank you for all the ways that you have encouraged us and blessed us as we've had these tough conversations, and as we have been blessed by our clinicians each Wednesday night. And we are honored to be able to walk this path with you, and be praying for our church as we continue to have conversations about what mental health conversations continue to look like here at Providence Road. So please be praying for us. We covet your prayers. Thank you for joining us tonight.